Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I've got answering student questions. Actually, just one question this time. This is an excerpt of what became a 5.5-hour video that I made for my students this summer. Right? They asked in a discussion forum a series of 25 questions, 25 students, 25 questions, and I decided I would do a video response to them. In my class, when I'm doing face-to-face, they ask anonymous questions, and I have to stand in front of the class and give a somewhere between a 2 and a 5-minute response. Now, I'm not limited to the 5 minutes since I was on video, and obviously I wasn't limited because I went for hours and hours and hours. Some students got an entire lecture in response. So I've taken a couple of those questions, and I've made small videos out of those. And then eventually I'll publish the entire video. But I just want to remind you, as you listen to my responses, these are mostly on the fly. I mean, I didn't do a lot of preparation to answer these questions. I simply looked at it and said, here's how I would respond to that. Here's some thoughts of mine. And those thoughts also are in the context of this is a class that has a broad spectrum of students in it from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different opinions about mostly the topic of evolutionary biology. And so my responses have that in mind. Some of my responses are a little different than maybe the tact I would take if I were sitting down with you over a cup of coffee and talking about these subjects, or if I was talking to a specific critic or something like that. So just bear that in mind in terms of the style of response that I'm going to provide for some of these questions. I'm also in a sort of a teaching mode because I'm trying to use my responses to help them understand some principles. So I'm breaking down some of their questions into fundamental assumptions and trying to derive sort of like things that I know that they're going to need to know, through the rest of the class, and trying to sort of squeeze those elements into my answers to their questions. Okay, so with that caveat, or those caveats, let's proceed to answering a student question. Coming on up. I've grown up in a Christian household all my life and have attended Christian education throughout my life. I've always been fascinated by the topic of evolution, especially when it comes to humans. I even took an evolution and archaeology class in my high school. It was an interesting experience because there were topics in class that were taught and discussed that did not necessarily align with the Catholic Church taught. Is it possible to reconcile the scientific concept of evolution with teachings and beliefs of Christianity and other religions and hold similar views without causing tension and conflict? And so, okay, I just did a big, long, rambling answer to the previous question about how would one teach evolution in a school and what would they want to cover. So all I'll add to this is I think it's possible to have professional dialogue to teach students the facts, all right, of evolutionary theory, what evolutionary theory is, in a way that says, this is not something that I am forcing you to believe. This isn't a belief. This is simply, as a scientist, what do scientists do? They look for the best possible explanations for the observations they see in this world, right? We observe things in the world. We ask, how did that happen? How did that come to be? Why is that the way it is? And we come up with hypotheses and we test those hypotheses. And evolutionary theory is a theory, right? Which is a well-tested hypothesis. So let's try a little bit different approach here. All right, I'm going to say that in general, I think it is possible to reconcile the scientific concept of evolution with the teachings and beliefs of most Christian beliefs. And I'd say most other religions can find a lot of compatibility between the two. Not perfect compatibility, and so there's going to be tension. But tension isn't always, tension is just part of life. There's always going to be areas that we're not going to agree about. And it's finding ways to have effective communication and dialogue about those tensions and to appreciate where the differences are and why those tensions exist. So let me give you some ideas, or I guess maybe approaches to being able to reconcile the two things. Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that both are interpretations, right? We have interpretations of the evidence of the world around us and the use of the scientific method to come up with explanations for the physical observations, the observations of the physical world. But there is an aspect in which you have to recognize if you are looking at, say, the Bible. And again, we're taking a sort of a Eurocentric view on this. And so I want to acknowledge that, of course, there's other religions that have tensions with evolutionary biology. But the primary one that we'd be concerned with is right, a typical Judeo-Christian viewpoint. And so you have to remember that there's interpretation of text, right? Even religious texts, including the Bible, are going to be open to interpretation. And so if you are of, say, a Christian background or heritage, it would depend on which background you come from, right? It's Catholic, Protestant, and then within Protestant, you might have Baptist and Presbyterians and so forth. And even Presbyterians, you have different kinds of Presbyterians that have different approaches and interpretations of Scripture, right? Different interpretive frameworks to understanding what the Scriptures teach, right? So most religious scholars and theologians, they do interpret Scripture or creation accounts metaphorically or symbolically, right? That allows for a fairly harmonious understanding within scientific explanations and even evolution. But there are some that interpret Scripture in such a way that there is definitely conflict, definitely differences, definitely places where science says this, and my religious interpretation says this. And that's where one is faced with this, like, which one do I choose? And I tell people when they talk to me about questions like that, well, then how do I decide what to choose? And one of my first answers is, it's important that you don't think that you have to choose like today, all right? Because you have to understand that we're all learning, all right? I'm learning, even at my age. I find that I'm still trying to understand Scripture and religion better and trying to understand what true faith is. And I'm also trying to understand the science better. And I have had several different forms of tension, throughout my entire life. And I would say even today, I could point to a number of areas where I find tension between those two, right? That I have convictions, right? Religious convictions. And I have convictions based on science or what appears to be the best understanding of the evidence, right? The best theories. And they don't completely sync up. And that used to bother me because you kind of feel like, okay, today I got to resolve this problem and I'm going to have to choose one or the other. But what I have found is that the tensions I had in the past, many of those are no longer exist because either I came to a better understanding of, the text, right, of Scripture, or I came to a better understanding of the science, which fit my understanding of religion better, right? And it's kind of gone both ways. And so I've seen a shift over time in different positions, and I found like some tensions have kind of dissipated, whereas some other tensions have increased. Like I've found new tensions I didn't know existed in the past. Maybe they were always there, or in some cases they were generated by something new that I discovered, right? Something new that I became convicted of in either area. And then I realized, well, this creates a new form of tension. And so all this is to say that if I have those tensions, but those tensions are changing, I shouldn't feel like that I'm at some absolutely critical boiling point where like now I have to make this decision where I'm going to go with one or the other, and that's just going to like change my life forever. Like I'm going to abandon one and only go with one other idea. No, I can kind of hold those things in tension over time. And so just speaking for me personally, I might live with tension for my entire life, and I might die not really having decided, which was the right answer. And I'm confident that someday at that point I will find out what the real answer was, that it wasn't absolutely important. Like this particular thing wasn't crucial. Like I don't have to have the answer, because not everything else about my entire being and who I am is dependent on that particular answer. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't maybe some questions, because that's what makes this whole topic of evolution so contentious and so difficult for some people, is that they feel like there are some really fundamental big issues, big why questions about like why the world is the way it is. I don't want to go into very specific things. but they feel like there's some really big tension issues. Like if I make this decision, this is going to take me down some path, right? That's going to greatly affect my entire future. If I take this other path, I'm going to have a whole different future. And I feel like I have to make that decision because this is like, I have to decide because there's so many other doctrines or so many other things that are dependent on this one idea. And for some people, I'll just throw one out there. For some people, that is like Adam and Eve, the reality of Adam and Eve as separately created human beings. For some people, that is like the big sticking point. They're like, I can accept all this other stuff, about evolution, but that's the one place where if I accept this, it's going to greatly affect my entire understanding, all right, of who I am and my relationship to other people and to a creator God or something like that, right? And so that becomes a really, really, really important one. But I would even point out that even there, that you don't like have to make that decision on like a particular day. Like that's something that you should think of yourself as a lifelong learner about, and you should be able to hold those things somewhat in tension with each other and say that this is something I know is important, but I'm going to let this percolate for a long time. And I only say that because I have 25 years of experience of allowing ideas to percolate and realizing that it was important that I didn't just have snap judgments, all right, about a lot of things in my life. You need to allow things to percolate over time. So also, it really is important that you differentiate, right? I think between scientific and religious explanations for things, right? You have to understand that science and religion, they are addressing different aspects of human understanding, right? Sometimes you think that you're asking the same question, but the two things you think are in tension are really, you're looking at possibly different sides of the same coin. And they're not actually in as much tension as you think, because the questions you're bringing to bear are not, they're not actually the same exact question, right? And religion can have a different answer to what seems like the same question, but you can think of it as you're looking at it from a different perspective, right? A different truth, multiple truths contained in the same thing. Sorry, I'm being kind of nebulous there, but I'm also slightly trying to avoid saying very specific things and giving specific examples because I don't want to get dragged down into, well, you said this about that and what's your view on that. I'm trying to be more general. Right? So, science seeks to explain the natural world through empirical evidence and the scientific method, whereas what is religion doing? It's a framework for exploring meaning, purpose, moral value. You might say, well, but doesn't evolution, isn't there evolutionary morals? And there's evolutionary biologists. Well, that's evolutionism. That's taking the science of evolution to understand biological diversity and expanding it to say, can I use it as a philosophy to understand lots of other things about the world and explain lots of other why questions? There are plenty of scientists, or really people outside of science, that co-opt evolutionary theory as a biological science and use it to try to explain lots of other things. And that's actually where a lot of the tension comes between evolutionary biology and, actually that's not evolutionary biology. Evolutionism as a philosophy, as an idea, as a broader idea. That's where much of the tension comes in between religion and science. Right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge there's distinct roles of science and religion, and that can help reconcile some of these different perspectives. Right? Another thing to consider is that from a religious perspective, right, a theistic perspective, let's put it that way, is accepting that God uses methods, right? We can't go into all the different ways that a creator God could interact in the world. Is he completely in control of every single little thing? Does he start things up and put things into place and lets them run? And so they kind of follow some kind of patterns, but he's not really in control. Different religions and even within Christianity, there's lots of strains of thought about God's sovereignty and control. And this is where you get different ways of interfacing evolution and scientific principles with religion. Because some people would say like evolution is just God's method of creation, right? They embrace the idea that evolution can be seen as a mechanism by which God creates or unfolds creation. And so in that case, Genesis is simply a metaphorical description of what God's doing, because obviously God's not going to explain natural selection to a more primitive audience that wouldn't understand, like, and is actually not interested in the mechanism of how God made things. God's telling them why things are made and the purpose of creation. So this perspective could view evolution as a natural process still, but it's either guided or sustained or just part of the unfolding of God's initial setup. So for some people, that creates this harmonious interaction between the integration of scientific understanding and religious beliefs. All right. Who knows how long I've talked about this. I mean, this might have been a half hour, which is way too long. As I said before, in a live class, I would only have 5 minutes to answer these questions. Imagine how limiting that must feel, to have 5 minutes. But I would just hit, a couple of those things as bullet points very quickly. And what I would typically do is I would just encourage students, if they wanted to explore anything that I've said further, I'm more than happy to talk to students outside of class about these things. The most important thing is that I think students should be allowed to ask questions. And I emphasize, of course, that the thing they're responsible for on exams and all that is, this is like, you need to understand the concept, just like in any other class. Here's the base of knowledge. Here's the things that are known in this particular field by the people that study this particular area from a scientific perspective. And you're responsible for knowing what those facts are and what that theory is. All right. But obviously that theory interacts a lot with your own personal lives and other things you've learned and other experiences you have. And so I think it's important for you to be challenged with that by each other. And I'm willing to talk about that, beyond the scope of the class. But this isn't something that I'm going to spend time talking about in class. We're just sort of sticking with, let's just say, we're sticking with the facts and just learning, what this theory is. But as I emphasized before, part of the reason for the Q&A sessions, especially my anonymous Q&A sessions, is to I don't want students to feel like, yeah, you say you're just doing the science, right? You're just giving us the facts. Like, here's just what, here's what the evidence is. But how do I know you're not cherry picking the evidence? How do I know you're not like spinning it in a certain way, or like not really telling me exactly, like not presenting the negative evidence to me. And maybe you're avoiding like the really hard questions, like, you don't really have answers for this. So you're just sticking to things you have answers for that make sense and sound really powerful. And so somebody who has a very skeptical perspective on evolutionary biology, I understand is going to be skeptical of whatever they're being taught. And so these sessions are meant to, they're not going to 100% alleviate that skepticism, but at least it gives a student gives you a chance to ask that question and to see that you're being engaged with, right? To say like, okay, well, he can't completely avoid this. All right. He's got to address this in some way. You might not be happy with, like how I address it. But I hope it at least encourages you to open up your perspectives on things.